You seek the key, but first you must learn the ways of precision, craft, and performance with Acura's all-electric ZDX. With a premium Bang & Olufsen sound system, up to a 313-mile range, and a Type S variant with an estimated 500 horsepower, the ZDX is their most powerful SUV yet. Unlock the energy when you visit Acura.com to order yours today.
Get ready, because Clear the Rack is on at your Nordstrom Rack store. Now through Monday, find incredible deals on wear now styles on sale for even less at Nordstrom Rack. Take an extra 25% off red tag clearance throughout the store from brands like Vince, Veronica Beard, Frame, Sam Edelman, and more. All sales final. The best stuff goes fast, so shop this sale at Nordstrom Rack today. Please see nordstromrack.com or ask a store associate for details.
I have to say, this next guest has recently become one of my all-time favorite writers. And he has a very different kind of style that I'm used to reading. But I started reading one of his books, and it turned out to be the book that's just coming out, Table for Two, which is some of his short fictions plus a novella called Eve in Hollywood, which I didn't know it at the time was the sequel to his first novel, Rules of Civility. And then he wrote another book, A Gentleman in Moscow, which is one of the best books I've ever read. In fact, by the time this podcast comes out, it's going to be a TV series starring Ewan McGregor and looks amazing. The book, again, all of his books are among the best fiction I've ever read. So I highly recommend Gentleman in Moscow, Table for Two, Rules of Civility. The Lincoln Highway is another book of his, which actually I'm just reading right now, post-podcast. I hope I get a chance to talk to Amor Towles again, because I have questions now about the Lincoln Highway. And he was so open about his writing process, and it's a really different writing process than I've talked to. You guys know I've talked to a lot of writers over the past 10 years, and he has a very different process for his writing. He's very open about it. Such a pleasure to talk to. And I always enjoy talking to writers, but we really went into depth into his experiences and how he puts together his books and kind of the experiences in his books. I can't say enough about how much I admire this person. Amor Towles, author of A Gentleman in Moscow, author of the upcoming book of short fiction, Table for Two, which I highly recommend. And, of course, the TV series. Check it out, A Gentleman in Moscow.
This isn't your average business podcast, and he's not your average host. This is the James Altucher Show.
By the way, I wanted to tell you, the very first thing I read by you was your shorter fictions, like this book, Table for Two, which is coming out.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, so I read, Eve in Hollywood before Rules of Civility.
Yeah.
So and Eve struck me as this amazing character, which I then recognized that type of character in your other novels. There's a certain nobility to the characters that I could tell you love the most.
Yeah, right.
And I know your most recent book coming out is A Table for Two. It's your short fictions, but really, I just also just love, of course, A Gentleman in Moscow, which you could also arguably be promoting as well, since the TV series starts March 29th.
Yeah.
So, if you don't mind, maybe first we could talk about that book, because there's so many things I love about this book, and it strikes me when reading this book, the characters are everything. It seems like you focused almost for years on building these characters, and then layered around them is the backdrop of history, the hotel, the other characters, to give kind of this semblance of a moving plot as history moves forward. But it's just ways to bring about these amazing characters, and particularly the Count, to give him more layers of his personality. And that's the book, is his evolution almost.
Yeah, that's true. Absolutely.
And so constructing that, am I close in how you constructed something like that?
So I'll start by saying I've written fiction since I was a kid. I wrote it in high school, college, graduate school. It's really been the thing that I've always wanted to do the most. But if you think about narrative, the novel, let's say comparing it to other classical art forms like landscape painting of the Hudson River School or the classical repertoire, the symphonies and concertos of the 19th century. A Hudson River School painting when you see it across the room, you can have an immediate sense of time and place and mood. Like the second you see it. I don't mean like you know which hill you were standing on. I just more mean the grander sense of nature, of possibility, of the evening, of spring, or all these various elements that speak to you as soon as you see it. And in music in a similar way can transmit an emotional state instantly. A very capable cellist can make you happy or sad within 3 strokes of the bow. And now a novel can do both of these things. It can give you a sense of time and place and mood. It can give you put you into an emotional state of one kind or another, make you happy, sad, angry, laughing. It is more cumbersome than these other 2 art forms in achieving these goals. Now, but what a novel can do that the other art forms cannot do is put you in the position of another human being. Because that's really what is unique, I think, to the novel. And that's why it's been such a persistent art form over, several hundred years. I don't even think film can achieve it in the same degree. But when we read a well-written novel, we can become so tied to a character or individual characters that when something funny happens to them in the book, we laugh out loud in our living room. When something sad happens to them, we cry, right, over the pages. We can get furious and indignant when they've been cheated, right? So there's this great sense of bond that can occur between the reader and an individual that is well crafted in a novel. And the reader can start to see the world through their eyes. And this, of course, is why the novel has been, many studies have shown that it is a very powerful tool for developing empathy, because it is by stepping into these other shoes and looking at the world through the eyes of this other individual and adopting some of their problems and challenges that we are more capable in doing that with a human being who we meet in the street, to empathize with their situation. So it's a big intro, I understand, but I'm getting to your question, which is that given all I've just said, if you're interested in writing serious narrative, then focusing on the creation of 3-dimensional characters really should be of major concern, a primary objective, right? A novelist has to master setting, has to master dialogue, the communication of themes, the development of the poetics of the language, has to master all kinds of elements of craft. But creating a 3-dimensional individual or a series of them is really probably the most important. And that's why we look at, it's not a coincidence that Huck Finn is at the center of Huck Finn and Anna Karenina is at the center of Anna Karenina, that these individuals really are at the heart of those novels. And now there's a lot of literary art behind the story of Anna Karenina that Tolstoy has developed. There's a lot of literary art behind Twain's Huck Finn, but the individuals are in sharp relief for the reader. So that's a big focus. And that's what I've spent, since I was a kid, constantly experimenting, investigating. How do you do this? How do you bring to life a different individual? You're probably, I really appreciate when a reader has read a book of mine and then goes backwards, right? And that's, it's a great compliment when that happens. You are probably the only person on the planet who has read my short stories and worked backwards. Because Table for Two, there's only maybe 500 people who've read it in the country, right? So I love that that's where you started. Well, the short story is where I started, right? And where most novelists start. And it's through the short story as a younger person that you practice this dynamic. You're constantly, each story is told from a different perspective. So at least that's the way I did it, right? So I'm doing a short story and saying, okay, This is a young woman in Berkeley in the late 60s at the beginning of feminism. Or it's an old guy who repairs violins in Vienna in 1940 or, 1910 or whatever. It's a young, Black American in the Jim Crow South, who's lost his way home. Or whatever it is, you take that different person in the world who you are not, and you start to try to imagine what is their situation? How do they see the world? What would they sound like? What would matter to them? What's their sensibility? And you start to, through the process of sort of the imaginative process, begin to construct this individual. And what your goal is to make them as three-dimensional and intricate as a fellow human being.
It's interesting because the way you're describing it, it's almost like, and I want to turn this into a question eventually, but there's craft and there's psychology. So let's take A Gentleman in Moscow for a second, and then I want to look at Eve and some of these shorter stories. But the Count in Gentleman in Moscow, you're given a person who with a background. Okay, this guy is from the aristocracy. He's not used to working hard labor, and then you're given a context. It's this transition, this massive transition in the 20th century between kind of the Tsarist Russia that he lived and grew up in and became an adult in, and it's immediately transitioning to the opposite, this Bolshevik revolution, the communists, and he's stuck in the middle and literally stuck, like he's exiled to live in this hotel the rest of his life. So you have this person with a lot of depth who's now put into a context with a lot of depth. And then from there, we're given the benefits of history evolving and characters moving around him, and that creates the story he finds himself in. And I wonder, and you have to give him a lot of depth because he has to survive this transition. So even in the early chapters, he's going from being sentenced to what could be considered a horrible sentence by some. He realizes he has to survive this. So be nice to people he wasn't necessarily going to be nice to before, and change certain habits and discover certain things and keep certain secrets. And from that, the whole novel evolves. But I also sense, and this is where the question comes in, there's a psychology here in that he's you're him a little bit. I will say from reading the little bit about your background, your father was an investment banker at a very white shoe banking firm. You went to Yale. You grew up among some of the finer things in life, but also have seen, several transitions in America. And how much do you infuse yourself into this character, particularly the main character?
I would say very little. My wife would say very little, by the way. She wishes I was the Count. I wish I was the Count.
I wish I was the Count, by the way.
I know,
I'm not
right?
criticizing.
No, I hear you. So me too. And of course, any character you create, there might be a thread of their behavior which is informed by some aspect of my own personality or experience, and that can be helpful in bringing that character to life. But if you look at the breadth of my work, Rules of Civility is a 25-year-old working class woman from New York, and Lincoln Highway is a 18-year-old kid and raised on a farm in Kansas in the 40s and 50s. So it is true that so there's a lot of variety there. Never mind all the bit characters, but
and I'll bring up the Rules of Civility in a second, because that's almost a mirror image of A Gentleman in Moscow,
in a way,
but doesn't necessarily disagree with my point.
Yeah,
but
no, you're right. And so let me give you a sense of the flavor of what happens. So for me as a writer, is you start with this idea. There's going to be a guy trapped in a hotel. And then right away I was like, he could be an aristocrat. He could be in Russia. After the revolution, he's sentenced to house arrest in this fancy hotel across the street from the Kremlin called the Metropole. And the book could be, the entire span of from the revolution to the Cold War. All that is sort of in day one as I'm beginning to imagine the story. Now, as you say, I've got this guy, he's an aristocrat. And so now you're right that my background gives me some insight into what that might mean. Now, most of what I know about that is actually not from my own personal experience. It's from the fact that we've all read about the aristocracy in the 19th and 18th century, whether we've studied history or we've read literature, and you want to keep in mind that the aristocracy in England, France, Russia, Spain, Italy was all the same, basically, right? I mean, they shared more in common with each other than they shared with their fellow countrymen. But a portion of that heritage shows up in the United States in sort of the form of the gentlemen of, say, the founding fathers. Jefferson, Washington, Adams were absolutely, their ambition was to be gentlemen. I mean, to be gentlemen in the traditional sense. And that meant some combination of having manners, behaving well in society, but more importantly, being a person of integrity. And they saw those two things as really being bound at the hip. So never lying, helping those in need, fighting against the susceptibility to the sins, trying to bring out the greater virtues of the individual. These were part of the tradition of chivalry, which I think ended up in the gentlemanly sort of version of the aristocracy. There's a terrible version of the aristocracy too, but the gentlemanly version was this. And that got inherited by the founding fathers, who all studied the Age of Enlightenment and the Stoics and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, growing up in Boston, going to Yale, you're on the one hand, you're studying this world to some degree, when you're reading the 19th century novel or studying these historical figures. On the other hand, you've witnessed some version of it in, waspy Boston, let's say. So that might be a help. But at the end of the day, I'm starting with the Count. I have a sense of the aristocratic bearing from sort of the universal imprint. But then you got to figure out the individual. And so you start to imagine him. Where was his situation? What was his childhood like? Where are his parents? Who are his closest relatives? At no point really am I actually writing down what does he look like. I think I knew he was tall. And then eventually I know he has a mustache. But that's kind of it. And I don't care about that. It's more trying to understand, begin to imagine what was his experience. And that informs, to some degree, the kind of person he might be like. Now, this is getting in the weeds here. But
go ahead.
Okay, what I'll do is when I have an idea for a story, I do what is called a design phase for me. I'll spend 3, 4, 5 years thinking about the book. And I'll fill notebooks by hand, imagining everything that happens in the book, all the settings, all the characters, their backgrounds, their personalities, the key events and what they might mean, the tone of the work as a whole, some of the thematic elements, some of the poetic elements, some of the imagery. I'll do that for years by hand before I sit down and outline the book and begin chapter 1. That's the design phase for me. Now, during that, I'm beginning this process of building the individuals, right, in my head.
This is pre maybe kind of establishing the vocabulary of the book.
Yeah, that's right. And well, I'm beginning to establish the vocabulary through this process. And that's kind of my point. It's very, for me, and I think for many, it's very iterative. People are listening, but for you on the screen, I'm going to show you, it's a spiral dynamic, okay, so you start with this Count, this figure, Count Rostov, and I say, okay, yeah, I think he's like this. I'm beginning to have a sense of him. And now I'm beginning to invent events that he's going to go through. So I'm imagining the events, and I see him in the event, and maybe there's an encounter. And now while I'm beginning to think about the encounter, imagining it, even writing about it, what'll happen is I'll say, wait a second, he wouldn't do that, he'd do this, right? And because the important underlying concept here is that if you think of us as human beings, the people occasionally there's a shy person, occasionally there's a mean person, but mostly we are all shy under some circumstance. We are bold under a different circumstance. We are mean under some circumstance. We are charitable under a different circumstance. We have the capacity to be all these things, and different circumstances bring these traits, these human traits, to the surface. And it's all within the same personality, right? We have a lot of contradictory behavior in the individual, in the expression of the individual in life. So as you're imagining, you start maybe with a relatively two-dimensional sense of a character. You start to imagine them in a circumstance. Your instincts say, wait a second, this guy wouldn't do A, he'd do B, which is kind of contradictory, but that's right. And now I understand him better. So you say, okay, let's go back to the beginning. Because now I have a richer sense of who he is. So let's start again. So, okay, so this happens. Okay, then this happens and he does that. And okay, now he moves forward and now he's made this relationship and that relationship and another event occurs. Again, you go through a moment of discovery. Because when he's this person, a new aspect of his personality expresses itself. So again, you got to go back to the beginning a little bit. Because now I have an even richer sense of who he is. And so you do this, and each time I'm moving forward in the story, you're kind of rewinding and getting a more and more intricate sense, not only of him, but of those he's encountering, of the events, of what they might mean, of the settings. All of the elements are being revised through getting a keener and keener sense of what is happening in the moment, right? As through the imaginative process. And as a result of this, if you do it enough, suddenly you end up hopefully with a character who is more three-dimensional than if I wrote 3 character traits down on a piece of paper and said, that's the guy, and which would be a kind of flat individual at the end of the day. And now, so here's another thing which you pointed to, which may interest you. But anyway, I do all this work, right? And I've even written some paragraphs, some opening paragraphs, and some scenes or whatever. When I sit down to write the novel itself, that's when you really have to start to pin down what exactly is going to be the language. Now, I may have versions of it in my mind. I may have already, paragraphs I've written that seem like they're on the right track. But once I'm writing the book, there's no more exploration. I got to start to commit to what it's going to sound like. And so in the writing of the first chapter, and this has happened with me every book, what ends up happening after all these years of thought, now that, I'm writing chapter 1, there will often be, or tend to be, a sentence or two where it comes finally into sharper focus for me. And I can tell you exactly what the sentences were in A Gentleman in Moscow.
Tell me.
It opens with the trial, which is the transcript. He then gets marched on page 1 out of the trial across the Red Square and into the hotel by 2 members of the Red Guard. And he's approaching the staircase in the lobby. And so I know all this is going to happen. I just haven't written it out yet, right? So he's approaching the staircase and he stops and he turns to the 2 Red Guards and he says, "Gentlemen, the lift or the stairs?" And they don't know what to do. They're looking at each other. And he thinks to himself, how can you be expected to succeed on the field of battle if you can't make a decision between whether to take the lift or the stairs? So he chooses the stairs on their behalf, and then he takes the steps 2 steps at a time, takes the stairs 2 steps at a time, as had been his habit since the academy. And I remember that little coming out really fast, And now, in that little 2 or 3 sentences, I know so much now about the Count and what this narrative is going to sound like. The concept that he would stop and ask his oppressors, which one are we going to do, the lift or the stairs? Sort of funny, sort of gentlemanly sort of thing to do under the circumstances. The highfalutin sort of self-important thought he has. How can you succeed in the field of battle if you can't make a decision between the lift or the stairs? And then that thing of he takes the stairs 2 steps at a time, as had been his habit since the academy. That's the guy, right? And so that, when I hit a sentence like that, I hit a period, and I'm like, okay, that is suddenly I know it for what it is. It's like a pole star. It's that as I'm moving forward, this is the starting place of this individual. I know a lot about him. I know a lot that's going to happen to him. I know what's happened to him in the past. But now I'm really beginning to hear what describing the world through his eyes sounds like. And that then you're using that as the basis to start to unfold the story. Now, of course, he's evolving, the world's evolving, so that has to change too. The tone of the book changes, the sentiments that he's going to have change, but that's the powerful starting point for me.
It's interesting because by that point, when you write that sentence, you already know, because of the years of work beforehand, you already know everything about him. Like, he's an aristocrat. He's in this, Bolshevik transition, and so he's going to have to learn to deal with that. And obviously he will, because he the whole novel he survives. I mean, or at least he has to make a novel live for the whole several hundred pages, and But what did you specifically learn about him once you write down that he says that sentence?
It's not so much, well, it's not so much that I'm learning something about his personality or his background or what's going to happen. It's more I'm learning what writing about him should sound like. And so now, the Gentleman in Moscow is in the third person, but it's not an omniscient third person. So it's not like a Henry James narrator who knows all. What's happened in the past, what will happen in the future, what is the interior lives of all the characters. It's not that, right? The narrator of A Gentleman in Moscow, most of the book, is in third person, but is clearly a close representation of the Count's point of view, his sentiment, his sense of humor, his sense of what is important. It's influenced by his emotional past. It's his vocabulary and semantics, you know. So in that kind of so that's a big challenge in if you're going to write like that, is you have to begin to hear that. You have to hear in a narrator who is an expression of the Count's inner life, his personality, his experiences, his vocabulary, what in fact would that sound like? Now, if you look at like a book of mine like The Lincoln Highway, where there's 8 different perspectives in that book, you have to do that 8 different times. You have to, because when you shift from hearing an Emmett chapter to a Duchess chapter or a Woolley chapter, the language of those chapters is changing. The vocabulary is changing, how poetic they are, how practical they are, how blunt they are, you know, and there's a linguistic implication for all those aspects of personality. And you don't sit there and say, he was blunt. You know, what you do is in the way that you're describing the world through that character's eyes, there's a bluntness to that, to the language that you're using.
Yes, it's totally true. Airbnb has changed my life. If anything, they have made my life so much better. Like, I used to live in Airbnbs. I lived in over 100 or 200 different Airbnbs over a 3-year period, and I loved it. I became a really good guest of Airbnbs, and I got to know lots of hosts. So when I initially owned a house, of course, the first thing I thought was, I'm going to turn my house into an Airbnb because I travel a lot. So why leave my house unused when I can make a side income by letting others Airbnb my house or come to stay in my house as guests? And having my own Airbnb or being a host for Airbnb has allowed me to do just that. And I've met other hosts. I've actually spoken at Airbnb's host conference. I think it was in 2017. I met so many just nice hosts. It's a great community. And I love, turning my own home into an Airbnb. Like, I'm traveling to Austin next month. My home's going to be an Airbnb while I'm away, and I'll stay in an Airbnb. I'd rather stay in like a 3-story house Airbnb than in one tiny hotel room in the middle of Austin during South by Southwest. So listen, while you're away, your home could be an Airbnb. Many people host on Airbnb, but there are people who are just letting their house sit empty, who've never thought about it or didn't realize their space could be an Airbnb. Hosting can easily fit into your lifestyle and is a great way to earn some extra money. So if you have a home, but you're not always at home, then you have an Airbnb. Your home might be worth more than you think. Find out how much at airbnb.com/host. I remember last year I was asked to go speak at the Norway Business Summit, and I was so excited because side by side with the Business Summit was the Norway Chess Summit, where I would get to see in person Magnus Carlsen, the best chess player ever, playing chess. But it was 4 plane rides, like, to get to the city that ultimately I would go to. So I really did not want to fly for 14 hours, and they were willing to pay for everything for me. So I at first class. So I didn't want to fly for 14 hours and not be first class. So I had to hurry up and get on the phone immediately to get those first class tickets to a chess tournament in Norway. And listen, this is just like when, you have to know when you want the best of anything, you have to act quickly or someone else will get it instead. And I did not want those seats to fill up. So it's like if you're hiring for your business, you want to find the most talented people for your open roles before the competition scoops them up. I just was talking to a friend this morning where he was trying to decide between some programmers, and he waited a little too long, and both the programmers he was interviewing took other jobs, like great jobs. So, what's the best way then to hire the best as quickly as possible? ZipRecruiter. ZipRecruiter finds qualified candidates fast. And right now you could try it for free at ziprecruiter.com/James. Just try it and see. You'll find out. So ZipRecruiter's powerful matching technology takes center stage to identify the top talent for your roles. Immediately after you post your job, ZipRecruiter's smart technology starts showing you qualified people for it. And I know this because one time I signed up as an employee, potential employee on ZipRecruiter, and I got nonstop. Really, even though obviously I wasn't looking for a job, I love what I do, but I just wanted to see what would happen because they were a sponsor of my podcast. And the most interesting jobs would pop up in my emails like, hey, you're qualified for this or that. And so it's interesting to see. So just go there and try it. Try ziprecruiter.com/James. Amp up your hiring performance. Now, this is more for if you're hiring, but amp up your hiring performance with ZipRecruiter and find the best fast. See why 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day. Just go to this exclusive web address right now to try ZipRecruiter for free. ZipRecruiter.com/James. Again, that's ZipRecruiter.com/James. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire. So I think you never say something like, he was blunt. You're always giving him blunt ways to say something,
Yeah,
or
that's right.
non-blunt ways to say something.
That's
Like,
right.
I could almost I happen to be open to one page right here just by coincidence. He's sewing with side by side with Marina, who's one of those few characters who is blunt with him. And, uh, licking the thread and closing an eye, just as Marina had taught him to count, thread of the needle faster than saints enter the gates of heaven, forming a double loop, tying off a knot, and snipping the thread from the pool, and on and on. There's like you seem to know a lot of things. Like, how to describe sewing, and then metaphors to use, so it's not just, he's sewing fast. And then here's a section, or here's a paragraph. He's putting, eating a spoon of honey from his home, his hometown, basically. So dutifully, the Count put the spoon in his mouth, and in an instant, there was the familiar sweetness of fresh honey, sunlit, golden, gay. Given the time of year, the Count was expecting this first impression to be followed by a hint of lilacs from the Alexander Gardens, or cherry blossoms from the Golden Ring. But as the elixir dissolved on his tongue, the Count becomes aware of something else entirely. Rather than the flowering trees of central Moscow, the honey had a hint of grassy riverbank, and on, until you get to the other stuff. And it's you seem to have a lot of knowledge about a lot of things that you bring into this character, like just everything about the wines, the music, the literature he's read, the I think when you're describing the barber, the exact dances that the Cossacks did, and using that to describe how his fingers are dancing over his head with the clippers, like, it's more than just research for this character somehow. Like, and I'll say it bluntly, like, you're really smart somehow. And it shows
Okay.
up in these pages in the way
Yeah.
you describe things. Or do you just research everything about the settings for this character?
I'm not really a research-driven writer, so I don't tend to research my work. But what I do is I write about things that as you say, I feel very comfortable with a depth of knowledge already. So I had fallen in love with the Russian novel when I was, say, 17 or 18, and I read Tolstoy, I read Dostoevsky, I read Gogol and Turgenev and Chekhov, and then I began to read the 20th century Russian figures before the revolution and then after the revolution. So by the time I was writing A Gentleman in Moscow, I had more than 30 years of being a fan, as it were, of Russian culture, having immersed myself in narratives and by the different Russian masters, and knowing something about the art and political landscape of Russia and how it changed. And so I know that because I was a fan in a way. And that's why I was willing to set the book in Russia. I could have told the exact same story under a dictatorship in South America, let's say. I could do it in China, to set it today in China, right, where there are still artists under house arrest. But I wouldn't have done that because I don't have that decades of granular familiarity with those environments that I had with Russia. And so it was sort of a good place to draw from. Now, my instincts are, as you're trying to find the right image or find the right reference to fit into a narrative, like you're talking about, like the scissors being similar to the dancing of the cassock or what have you. If it doesn't
the Hopak dance.
Yeah, thank you. If it doesn't come from a place of deeper knowledge or familiarity, it's not going to sound right. You know what I mean? If I Googled, what would be, this, and then plop it in, it's going to feel that way to the reader. It's something about it. It doesn't feel quite, organic enough. And so I'm wary that's part of the reason I'm wary about research, is that it's hard once you're doing it to sense, as the writer, where did I just put in something that's going to sound inorganic, because it's right, but it may not sound organic to the reader in a way that the genuine expression would, right? And so I do try to draw on stuff I know. Now, I think writers are like this, right? We read a lot. We're observing the world with intent, right? And so it doesn't mean that we're smarter than anybody, but we're taking in weird things. Different kinds of language are very interesting to writers. And so you read a legal brief, and you're like, oh, that's interesting. Why do they? That's how they construct sentences in the legal brief, and that's that's the tone of it. That's the pace of it. That's the way they make a point. This is what's missing. What are all these things? Where are all that stuff? And then you see. A politician in the South, and you hear him talking, and you're like, oh, that's to hear that Southern oratory, that's its own thing. And then you hear, a technical person, and you're like, so that's what technical language sounds like. So every time you kind of hear that, you're kind of absorbing a little bit of it, and being, if I had to write a Southern political speech, those are the elements that would sort of be keynotes to help me start to craft something that made it seem authentic. But you can many Americans wouldn't necessarily remember it or think about it in those terms, but when you're a writer, that's what you are listening to and listening for. And that gives you a little bit more facility in using a different type of language that's not yours to bring to life a person who you are not.
And I think there's two other things that are helping you with constructing the language in this, is that you've spent all this time creating the story without thinking about language, and you've spent all this time thinking about the character, so that when you're finally writing the book, it's almost as if you've outsourced plot and character to your prior self from the past 2-3 years, whatever it was, and so you can focus on then layering in this language, as opposed to and it's a legitimate thing. Like, many writers write their first draft from beginning to end and then start working it out. But you can't really have the depth of language if you write in that linear fashion. It has to be perhaps a little bit more cliffhanger focused. Okay, I'm ending a chapter. What's the cliffhanger? And then I drive into the next chapter. And there's nothing wrong with either approach, but I really appreciated it in your novels, because you could see that now that you explain how you layered it, it makes sense. Because I was wondering, how is he just weaving these? It's like each paragraph's like a poem. The way you're writing these characters is really amazing.
James, I really appreciate that question because you're absolutely right. And it's one of the things I talk about planning and outlining and all these things, and it may sound very, it's scientific or whatever. But you're absolutely right. There's a counterintuitive aspect there, which is that I do all that just as you described, so that when I get to the writing of a chapter, all the decisions are made and I can free up the most poetic part of myself to do the actual crafting of the sentences and the final imagining of imagery, et cetera. And I mean, to put it in technical science, modern science, by planning, I'm trying to diminish the influence of the left side of my brain, which is the decision-making logical portion, and to free up the right side of the brain, which is subconscious and poetic and dream, where that originates. And whereas, just like you said, if I did not do the planning, when I got to the chapter and you're sitting there having to say, okay, well, what happens? And what does the room look like? And wait, who's this guy who comes through the door? What's his name? What did he do yesterday? What does he want? What are they saying to each other? That's suddenly this decision-making part of the mind which takes over, and it can overwhelm the other side, which is the one you want to rule the day in the crafting of sentences. You want the poetic side to sort of surprise you with the word choice, surprise you with the image, to come up with a parallel that you had never thought of before. And that can be, when the subconscious is really kicking it, it can be very powerful. A good example, I think, in The Gentleman in Moscow is when the Count, there's a big turning point in the early part of the book. I needed something to happen which would make him really depressed or feel like his time was over, basically. And during the design phase, after trying many different things, eventually I'm like, oh, I know. He's gonna go to dinner at the fancy restaurant, and he's gonna ask for a fancy bottle of wine, and they're gonna tell him that there's only red and white wine now. And he's gonna be what? And they're gonna take him down, the maitre d' is gonna take him down to the wine cellar, and the Bolsheviks will have removed all the wine labels from all the bottles, arguing that this old sort of prestige type of wine drinking was really out of step with communism. And of course, it's the straw that breaks the camel's back for him at that moment. And now I know this in the planning and stage. I figured this out in the design, and I kind of even have this image of he's going to arrive into the cellar with Andre, the maitre d', and he's going to walk the aisles, and that what he'll do is he'll go down into one of the rows of wine bottles, and he'll take one of the wine bottles in his hand, like Hamlet holding the head of Yorick, the skull of Yorick, and he'll reflect. And when I'm doing the design, I'm like, oh yeah, and he'll reflect. Like, I don't need to know at that point what he's going to say. I'll figure that out later. So when I'm doing the actual writing, and everything's planned and imagined in advance, and so that I'm now just doing the poetry of that scene, when I got to that moment where he took the bottle in hand, everything that follows that came really fast in the moment as I am imagining myself as the person I am not, the Count, in a situation I have never been. And the Count suddenly takes over, and he's like, his observation in that moment is that the wine is the perfect distillation of individuality. And we know that this is the way that wine works, right? That wine, the flavor of a wine is totally determined by the 50 square feet in which it's grown, or 100 square feet, because of the minerality of that soil, the slope of it, the altitude of it, its exposure to sun on average, its exposure to wind and cold. All those things are what define the flavor, and that changes like every 10 yards, to some degree.
I was wondering, even when you wrote that, and I remember that scene perfectly well, and there's a couple interesting things about that scene.
Yeah.
But with what that line that you specifically are referring to, how did you know that? Like, I don't know anything about wine, for instance, so you must know about wine.
Yeah, and again, in this sort of catalog of writerly stuff, so like, someone at some point, just you go to a vineyard in Napa Valley for the first time in your life, and the guy says that, and you're like, oh, that's interesting. That gets stowed away deeply because it's sort of like, oh, that's an intricate way in which nature works. Wow, I didn't know that. But you don't know, when I learned that, I didn't think, how am I going to use that? You know what I mean? It just gets logged away. And then, so as you say, in the subconscious, it suddenly presents itself. And you're like, oh yeah, this is perfect. It's a perfect sort of beautiful speech that the Count is going to give to himself about the tragedy of this is that wine is this unique thing, and when you remove all the labels, it's as if it's just drops in the ocean. But, but the added thing was that as I was finishing the Count's speech and I hit the final period, I was suddenly like, I was like, well done, Count. That was a beautiful little observation. And when I hit, then all of a sudden I'm like, wait a second. The Count's description of the wine and what's happened to it, this unique individuality of the wine, and then the removal of the labels, which treats it as if it's a drop in the ocean. It's exactly what was happening in the Soviet experience to people, right? That is what happened in the Soviet experiment, is that the individuality of humans was diminished in favor of some sort of universal ideal. And so then you're like, at some deep subconscious level, not only did my brain pull out this wine metaphor, as you say, because it's a nice poetic moment for the Count, but it did it in a way that actually it resonates with the overall theme of the whole friggin' book.
Right.
And I could never plan that.
Right, and that was what was so beautiful, comparing that to the decline in individuality.
One in 8. That's how many people have worked at a McDonald's, who serve millions the best Big Mac and best birthday party they've ever had, who haven't just seen kids graduate from a Happy Meal, but have gotten help graduating themselves. Because they know the skills learned here
Bienvenidos. Welcome to English Under the Arches.
can
Por
help you
favor,
grow
abra-
from here or keep growing here.
Hi, welcome to
One in
McDonald's.
8 start at McDonald's. And when you start, stays with you.
I don't want to give away any spoilers for the book and also for the series coming up, so let me try to do this in a way that doesn't give away any spoilers. It's not really a big spoiler anyway, but the person who first confronts him with the question of red or white, and in such a way that it becomes confusing to the Count because it doesn't have all this, subtlety anymore. That's like the one character the Count sees in almost a two-dimensional way. You refer to this as omniscient, third person, not third person omniscient, but third person from the Count's point of view. This is the one character we don't really get a sense maybe of who his parents were.
Yeah, that's right.
Did you do that on purpose? Because that's also how the Count is seeing him, whereas with everybody else, the Count tries to bring out the best in people.
Yeah, he's kind of a nemesis. And actually one of my favorite moments in the book, a favorite moment is, and again, no, we won't give anything away, but very late in the book, like in the final 50 pages, the Count and that figure have a confrontation. And for the first time, that figure describes in some detail how he sees the Count, and and sort of the root of his animosity towards the Count. And the Count is taken aback, and he's sort of like, "Oh my God, listen to that," because I think I think you're right. I didn't think of it consciously, but self-consciously, unconsciously, I think you're right that the limited description of that antagonistic figure was really an extension of the Count being somewhat dismissive of him. And so what I like about this moment is that it's sort of like the Count realizing, oh yeah, right. This guy's got he's got his own viewpoint, and his own background, and his own thing, which has informed why he's been doing what he's doing. He's not just a jerk, that there's this other thing behind it, And I would say that, so I think in the case of, and it's the bishop as the character, I think that, that's what happened there. But this kind of brings up an interesting, bigger point, which is that I'll write a first draft, and then the revision process is quite active for me. So the second draft, I will change, I don't know. There's not a page in the second draft that has not been changed, but there may be as much as a quarter of the book that I remove and an additional 25% that I'm putting back in that's brand new, right? And the removal it's about economy. I'm taking the first draft and I'm saying, okay, this chapter goes on too long. This paragraph is redundant. This character, this scene is a replay of the other scene. It should be one scene, and we'll combine the two concepts. Well, you're constantly sort of looking for better economy. And shrinking the text to make it, the same amount of, of energy and thematic power in it, but with fewer and fewer words, in essence. And sometimes that means the whole removal of a chapter, the removal of an entire character, the removal of the first 40 pages,
It
all
must
those
be
things.
challenging for you because you probably have to kill, as they say, many darlings because the
I love that.
prose is beautiful.
I don't, yes, right. And so like, I that phrase kind of drives me crazy. So like, and I'm not trying to say it about you, but like I said, writers, you got to be willing to kill your darlings. Well, that's kind of true, but like A Gentleman in Moscow would not succeed if it didn't have my darlings on every page, So,
Right.
you're killing a few, but yes, you have to get used to, as an editor, being objective and cold-hearted and try it, kill it and see now, take a step back, read it fresh and be like, oh yeah, you know what? It works better if I just throw all that out. And it's a better experience for the reader. I was explaining too much to the reader. I was giving them too much information. The reader, which diminishes, that's a paradox of writing, the more I describe the character or the situation, the less alive it's becoming, right? So you got to pare that down to its bare bones, where the electricity is, and then for the reader, it's got to, it feels alive, right? So that's the first part of the editing of the first draft. You take it down. Then you start to say, wouldn't it be interesting actually if this element was added, if this was added? Now, one of the big things that gets added in draft 2 is that in draft 1, I have over-described the 3 or 4 principal characters. There's too much about them, about what they think, what they feel, what they've done, what's happened to them, what's going to happen to them, And the secondary characters are not as fully realized as they should be. So through the economy thing, I'm shrinking the amount of material dedicated to those 4 leading characters, but they're actually becoming more brightly and sharply drawn. That frees up space, and I can use that to start doing justice to these secondary characters. And where and it's almost a nagging thing, like, they'll say, I'll say, that, like Marina. In the first draft, Marina, the seamstress, plays a smaller role, much smaller role than the second draft. And I love her, and I love her personality. And she, as you said, she's the one who's blunt to the count. And so that's a very powerful thing to bring into the story. And so like from draft 1 to draft 2, probably the word count for Marina doubled or something like that. So that you have this kind of thing where on the one hand, you're going in the draft, you're diminishing the amount of language to these characters to make them better rendered, and you're adding, words to these other characters to bring them into better life. And so, and you're right, the bishop is kind of a funny case because of the Count's prejudices towards him, that I never really give him what he's due until that final confrontation. And even then, he sort of gets shortchanged.
Well, but it's interesting, and I know we're spending a lot of time on Gentleman in Moscow. I want to talk about the rules of civility and of course Table for Two, which is being released. But look, Gentleman in Moscow again is going to be a Netflix series in a few days. So
not
fine.
Netflix.
Oh, not
Paramount,
Netflix.
Paramount Plus.
All right,
and Showtime.
sorry about that.
That's
I've seen the trailer on YouTube, but I didn't know what network it was on.
Yeah.
One thing I was curious about was the character of Mishka. You mentioned this is, again, third person in the point of view of, the Count. But there is one point, and I was just curious about this, there is one point where it seems like it's actually Mishka's point of view for the only time in the novel. And I wondered if you did that intentionally.
Yes, so...
and it was only one page.
Yeah, like 90% of the book, as I say, is from this Count's perspective. But there's a secondary narrator who plays a major role in the overall experience of the book. And that narrator appears initially in footnotes, sort of stepping in and making observations. Then that narrator often opens major chapters to orient you. What's happened during the Second World War? What's happened during the purges? There are addendums at the end of chapters where you leave the hotel and you follow Nina into the countryside or Andre home to where his son has died during the Second World War. And it's sort of, those are being given by this other narrator. And as you say, one of them is Mishka walking on the way to the hotel after doing time and sort of beginning to see Russia from his new sort of jaded, hard-hearted point of view, and And so, so there's these sort of, so it's not, it's that other 10%. And this is, again, it's one of those things like, without that 10%, it would be a vastly weaker book. You know, the 10% punches way over its weight because it gives you this counterbalance to the Count's optimism, to the limitations of what he sees, to his natural good nature towards others, to the centric quality of the story from his point of view. These sort of are beginning to show you what's going on outside the hotel. What are the challenges people are facing? What is the other kind of version of witnessing those events in, either darkly or sarcastically or cynically through, an experience of disappointment. And so you get this kind of thing. And with Mishka, we see it, when he goes and fights with his editor over Chekhov's story. We kind of follow him into this meeting where he has a confrontation. And so, there's no, I feel like part of the pleasures of reading over time is you realize that it would be very easy for an instructor to say, oh, well, when you've chosen the narrator, that should be the narrator. And if it's from the Count wasn't there, then we shouldn't see that. How can we suddenly shift and hear it from somebody else's point of view for one page without, But when we read books where that happens, you're like, oh, you can do that. If you do it well, you can do it.
Right, like every rule, I guess, is made to be broken. You just have to be careful because it's a risk.
Yeah, you have to be judicious about when and how you do it. And again, I've kind of said it. It has to be the kind of thing where the break allows this one page to have big emotional or intellectual impact for the reader, where it's not just, random. It really is something that it deserves to be told in that different way at that moment.
It's so interesting because now that you describe it this way, again, like you mentioned the footnotes were a great way to make it almost a third-person omniscient because the footnotes are very passive. It's like the footnotes of any book. It's just like, oh, by the way, we have a little more explanation here. Here it is. Don't worry about it. You just, here's some facts that fill in the context. So it's almost a little more passive than the passionate point of view of the Count. And then that's why it struck me that it was outside of the footnotes, the Mishka aspect. But at the same time, Mishka is almost this weird counterpoint to the Count. Like they're almost intertwined as two sides of one character in a weird way. Although Mishka plays a much smaller role, but it's why maybe you felt, okay, I could take the risk with this compact with the reader because Mishka is the Count in some way.
Yeah, and we deserve, because you're right, and you think about it thematically, or historically, actually, the revolution there were many intellectuals and sort of members of the aristocracy or related to the aristocracy who were in favor of the revolution, right? Because it's like many revolutions, it starts with the intelligentsia, right? It doesn't start with the peasants, right? It's a group of people who have been schooled, who have had access to things, who have become morally outraged, and who are writing the manifestos and begin printing out the leaflets, right? And so it wasn't uncommon for, at that early stage, to have two people who were basically had a very similar upbringing and may even been friends and quite close, who were suddenly on opposite sides of history. And so Mishka is, you're absolutely right, he's sort of a personification of that branch. Now, that branch in Russian history, as in many revolutionary histories, walked in full of optimism, full of vision, full of confidence, and ended up very dispirited, disappointed, disillusioned, right? Because the revolution did not fulfill its promise in the way that they imagined it at the beginning, right? And so I wanted to have someone who was like that part of the Russian experience, that part of the experience in a moment of historical transition. And so you do get, it does become important to leave the Count for a minute to sort of taste, in a way, the bitterness, that sense of deep disappointment from the person who's like, we're going to change the world, and feeling like it's going to happen in the first part of the book, and the second part of the book begins to get disillusioned, and finally, is just completely broken by the disappointment that Russia did not become what it could have become, right? And so it's important to have that as a separate thread, And like Nina, who's a young girl when the Count meets her, is again, it's like a different personification of an aspect of Russian history or of revolutionary history anywhere, which is that she was born at the time of the revolution, or basically shortly before.
She's like today's Gen Zs.
Yeah,
She grew up with the internet.
Yes, right. So everything's second nature to her. Of course communism's great. Of course it's great, and of course it's the only way to be. And because that's what she's been schooled in, and so she has a different kind of optimism than the Mishka, who's the intelligentsia from the 19th century, looking into the future. She's the one who's bought it hook, line, and sinker, because she's a communist youth, but she's going to have a different, they get disappointed in a different way, right? And may never completely, and even though they may be disappointed with the outcome, they may never turn their back on the party, that kind of person, right? Who says, my husband's doing time, and but it's important for the revolution to make certain sacrifices, towards this mission we're on. And that happened, right? These young people who adopted the mission so deeply. There were the kids who turned in their parents in Russia when things got hot, and did it proudly. It's crazy stuff. But so and so again, it becomes important to not only meet Nina, see her evolution, but then get a glimpse of her as she leaves the hotel and goes into adulthood and has to confront the realities of the Russia that she has admired since childhood.
And what's great is she and many other characters exemplify this aspect of the story takes place in the hotel. It's like a painting of the hotel, but you get this sense the painting goes off. Like, some paintings are just a portrait. You think that's the entire universe is just the portrait inside the painting. But some paintings, Sunday in the Park with George, there's things happening outside of the scene we're seeing. You just don't see them. The painting focused on this part. And so this is a painting of the metropole, but Nina and other characters exemplify that there are things going on outside the metropole. Sometimes we might find out what they are. Sometimes we'll never find out what they are. And that's part
right.
of the beauty of the book as well. And sometimes it's foreshadowed and sometimes it isn't. This bridges me to the Rules of Civility, which is another, that was your first published novel. And it's again like a mirror image of A Gentleman in Moscow. It's about by the way, I went into it thinking it was going to be about Eve, like all about Eve, because I had read Eve in Hollywood first. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to read about where Eve came from. And, but it's this, young lady who's rising up and kind of wants to fit in, let's say, upper class Manhattan, wants to meet, the love of her life in that class and have a dream life. But you get this sense in both books that one of the things you're really talking about is not only these kind of transitions and different stratus of society, but also the kind of roles we have to play. And this is very clear in both books. Like in Moscow, you have to kind of pretend. Are you going to be the proletariat worker, Bolshevik administrator, or are you going to pretend to be someone who could fit into this class of society? Or are you going to be the actress who has to wine and dine and pretend to be this in order to move from silent to talky? And there's everybody's playing like a role. And in Rules of Civility too, very clearly, everyone is kind of not themselves. They're all playing roles. And this is what's true in real life too. We're all just playing roles most of the time. It's hard to really even know who you are, let alone be who you are. And I just wonder how conscious you were during writing the Rules of Civility of this aspect.
I think generally you're right that appears often in my work because I find it very interesting, just in the way you describe it. I find it very interesting. There in the United States, there isn't like an upper class, a middle class, a lower class, or a working class, or whatever you want to say. There's like 70 classes, right? And that's true everywhere you go, right? There's incredible gradations in the experience of life in this complicated society of America, and some of that is influenced by wealth, and some of it by upbringing, and some of it by race, and some of it, by gender and by job. All these things are affecting how we're seen by others, how we present ourselves, and there's aspects of integrity and self-deceit which are bound in that, and that are choices or either made actively or passively. And so I find that, that's an infinitely interesting set of circumstances for me. And so the Rules of Civility, which is only this year in the life of Katie in 1938, and as you say, it's the year she's 25, she's beginning to understand or see how she might advance both socially and professionally in Manhattan, and you don't get to see the completion of it. You just begin to see how, okay, this is how this town works, and these are my opportunities sort of presenting themselves. And but as she's navigating that, yeah, we're getting to sort of see she's bumping into different of these tiers and beginning to understand the nuances between them, and the pluses and minuses around the choices that are made in order to participate or in order to win in that particular corner of New York life. And so I do find that fun and interesting and timeless too.
But then you see with the other characters, like, okay, Tinker, who I can't say, sometimes it's hard to talk about novels on a podcast because you really don't want, like a nonfiction book, we could talk about everything. Yeah. Fiction, obviously you can't. But, this aspect of really how hard different people try to fit into different roles, and I can't give even away the secret of the title, but then there's even the more conventional people in there. I'm forgetting the name now. The guy she dated for a short time who was younger.
Dickie Vanderwyle.
Yeah. Where you could clearly see he's playing his role, even though it fits more naturally to him. He was born and grew up that way, but it's still a role for him, and he has to live up to it. And whether he's good or not depends on his success at fitting into that role. Yeah. And it was, Rules of Civility, I don't know if you made this comparison at all, and for me this is a compliment, but it reminds me of Valley of the Dolls a little bit. Did you ever read Valley of the Dolls?
I haven't, no.
So the 1960s novel, of course, was sold tens of millions of copies.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of that too, just kind of this array of first starting with young women, but then array of the people they meet in New York as they're climbing in their 20s and what happens to them. And it's, again, beautiful in the same way that Gentleman in Moscow is, just really going in depth, and you learn, nobody's a cartoon. Even Dickie, at first I thought, is this going to be a cartoon and we're never going to see this guy again? But then you realize, okay, it goes more and more. And I'm avoiding talking about Tinker to talk about him, but it's the same thing.
Yeah, and I love, one of my favorite, I'll tell you two things about Dickie Vanderwyle, which I think you'll enjoy if you're not aware of it. But there's a scene there where Dickie is romantically very interested in the narrator, Katie. He's in love with her. And there's this other relationship that she's been interested in or whatever. And they end up having a moment where she's been avoiding him, and Dickie goes and finds her, and they're sitting on the steps of St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. And he says, hey, what's going on? Like, you haven't been, in essence, haven't been answering my calls. And so she sort of confesses, well, this is what's happened between me and this other man, and, where I was disappointed in his behavior. And Dickie, what he should do at that moment is say, oh, what a cad that man, what a terrible behavior of that, him. Come back to my place, we'll have a glass of whiskey and let's put it behind us and we'll have a good time. Like that's what he should do. But and I remember writing this and I wasn't, as I was writing it, he was changing the course of what he was going to say. Because suddenly you're like, what, he would never do that. And so instead what he says is, that's a tough one, because that thing that you said about him, I actually am kind of impressed by that. And the other thing you say, well, aren't we all kind of like that? And so he kind of totally against his own interests kind of takes the side of the other guy. And it's a moment where, and I like it in the book because of what you're describing, which is that as you meet him, he's very carefree and devil may care. He doesn't seem to take anything seriously. And she even kind of likes that about him, and he seems like a lightweight a little, to some degree. And this is a moment where he kind of turns the tables on her, and you realize, no, he's just like everybody else. He's more sophisticated than she's giving him credit for. And he's made an observation which really she has not been willing to accept, and it completely changes the way she sees the situation. And and I love that sort of this tenderhearted but revealing moment of Dickie. Well, so here's the other thing I want to tell you. So then she says, that at some point we learned that Dickie ended up all right. He kind of grows. Later on he grows up and all right. Well, do you know he appears in A Gentleman in Moscow, right? Do you know that?
Oh my God! Is he the?
He's
American?
He's Richard Vander
God!
Right, because he's Dickie.
My mind.
He's Dickie in his 20s, but by then it's after the Second World War.
Because that's almost like the American version of it. He's counterpoint to the Count almost.
Yes,
but from America.
And he has all the old personality traits. He's sitting at the bar. He's talking to the bartender. He's having a good time. But again, in that book, he does the same thing. There's a moment in which the Count is very low, and Dickie weighs in this really interesting and thoughtful way.
In a way that the Count might do.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, so that's the same character. Yeah, that's the same character.
That is fascinating.
I want to say one other thing about this sort of topic, which is that I was just with I'm friends with Michael Lewis. He was just interviewing me at the New Orleans Book Festival last weekend. And, he spent a year following around Sam Bankman-Fried with the intention of writing a book. And then just as he was about to begin writing, SBF's entire world blows up, right?
Sure.
Crypto collapse, accusations of fraud. Well, the thing I was going to point out is that what's interesting about it is that, like, seeing, for those of you, your listeners who know SBF, I'm sure you do, just from the press, his whole thing of, I don't comb my hair or get it cut, I wear sweatpants, that's just as sort of targeted a costume as, Dickie Vanderwell in a tuxedo, right? It's the same thing, right? He had his own version of it. And in Michael's book, and if you hear Michael speak about the SBF, or if you read his terrific profile in the Infinity book, his last work of nonfiction, Sam, I don't know him, but SBF is kind of somewhere on the spectrum, and he is not very good at reading emotional cues or giving emotional cues. And so as he's kind of rising, he's getting more and more success. He sort of thought, I'm going to trade stuff in a dark room by myself, and maybe I'll get rich, but I don't have to deal with people. But suddenly he becomes this public figure for cryptocurrency. He's worth more than $10 billion. People are seeking him out, investors, sovereigns, politicians. He starts donating money. So there's suddenly a public life is required of him that he has no training in, and that he actually has avoided his entire life. And so what Michael talks about is that he starts to teach himself how to act in public. So he doesn't understand jokes, and he doesn't find them funny, but he starts teaching himself to smile when someone tells a joke, or to pretend to laugh. And he develops all these techniques, to sort of nod an interest, or to be worried about the young woman who's working for him where he doesn't care at all, But because it's not in his nature to emote in that way, but it became essential to his behavior. So you have that. And then, then suddenly the guy gets arrested, loses all the money, gets arrested, and now he's in a suit with his hair cut, right? Right? So we've gone into a new costume, right? Yeah. Because if he wore the sweats with the crazy hair, to court, then he might be judged badly. So now he's got a whole nother, anyway. So like I say, this is eternal stuff, these ways in which we present ourselves, and both in clothes, in behavior, and in facial expressions, the language we use, and it is, it's loaded, it's targeted, it's both conscious and subconscious, and it shifts.
But what's interesting though is I'm really aware of it in your books. I'm not necessarily aware of it in every novel I read, but perhaps because maybe in part your books are about this, and the changing shifts of the roles the changing roles we play and how they shift and so on, because that's part of what your books are about. I feel very aware of it. Like, you ever watch like a James Bond movie and you get out of the theater and you feel like you're James Bond?
Yeah.
Like,
Okay. Yes, I do. Absolutely.
Like literally, I would read A Gentleman in Moscow, and I swear to God, people would comment on my posture as I'm going into the next room. Like, oh, you're standing up much straighter. And I felt like I had a better vocabulary. I felt much more at ease with the world. Like, so your books, like, put the reader into these roles very, very well. And that's part of what I enjoyed about them. And even, look, this is a good segue into Even Hollywood, which is kind of this spin-off novella. So your book Table for Two is coming out. It's a bunch of short stories and a novella. The novella is almost a sequel to Rules of Civility. Not quite a sequel, I don't want to say that, because again, for me, Rules of Civility was like the prequel to Even Hollywood. But Even Hollywood is Eve herself, and now I see it having read afterwards where she comes from. It's almost like she gets into Hollywood and everybody else is playing a role, but she's not really. I feel like she's herself. She's got this integrity that's beyond the role. I don't know, people can't even understand her because she's beyond the roles of what happens in Hollywood. And I loved that about her character and following her. Like, she makes decisions that the average person would not make throughout the novella.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's an interesting way to see then Hollywood through her perspective and your own perspective. Like, oh my gosh, maybe I would have taken the money there. I would have taken this opportunity there. And she doesn't, because she's playing this higher role, which I guess she learns in the hidden pages of Rules of Civility.
Yeah. And this isn't early in Rules of Civility. Eve is in a car accident, and so it's not a big spoiler, but it's early in the book.
And she's always very smart. She's always sparkling among everybody.
And she's always kind of willful and independent and spunky and attractive. But what happens is, and then I kind of remember, going back to this sort of imaginative cycles. I remember in imagining Rules of Civility, I knew her as this sort of great Midwestern spunky beauty who is independent and won't be ruled by her parents or by anybody else. And then I actually sort of imagine, well, what if you take that person and you throw them through a windshield, which is kind of what happens to her. And her beauty is damaged. She loses some use of her leg, whatever. I was suddenly sort of asking myself, what's a steely version, a hardened version of that person that we've come to know? Like, as if, the glass of the windshield is a wall, and it's like the looking glass for Alice. You go through it, and you carry with it all these personality traits, but it's suddenly a hardened version of it, because in a way, the accident was life cheating her, in some weird way, and her, resenting it, but also having to toughen herself up to now go on. And so what comes out is this sort of, as you're right, she becomes a person who survived that kind of thing is no longer gives a shit about the little stuff. You know what I mean? Like it is, she's moving forward at her own pace with her own mind and does not care about, the expectations of others, about the polite thing to do, about, she's not crass. But it's a freeing thing for her. She becomes a more independent person by virtue of having survived this accident, and so then
she could have also become, and perhaps in the Rules of Civility, a little of this happened. She could also have become bitter and grasping, because if she doesn't grasp for it now, she'll always lose it.
Yeah, that's right.
Because of what's happened to her.
Yeah, so she has a choice in that sense, and part of Rules of Civility is her grappling with who is she going to be in the aftermath of this accident, and she kind of goes through some transitions. But then, part of the fun of writing Even Hollywood is because even Hollywood, you're right, it's not a sequel, but it does kind of in essence begin the day after Rules of Civility for Eve, and it was you get to take this personality you've imagined and this sort of unique sort of combination of traits, which makes her both independent and willful and charismatic too, and drop her into Hollywood. Like, what would happen? You know, and that's why I wrote it, right? It's because it was kind of bugging me. Like, you know, we know she goes to California, but like, I was like, what happens when you take her personality and drop it in late 30s Hollywood? And then you get to kind of imagine, you know, that I spent, you know, years imagining all the things that would happen to her, and then eventually, you know, got around to writing it.
And why did you make that a novella? I mean, instead of a full novel? And that's sort of a naive question, because you could do whatever you want with it. There's no expectation. It could be a novel, but you could have maybe turned that into a full novel.
You know, it's a good question.
It's great as it is. I'm not saying you should have.
Thank you.
So,
you know, and I think the answer is that you know, it's written to some degree in the noir tradition. You know, it's overlapping with the noir genre, and in a variety of ways. And something about it, I love it. But it felt, in writing it, the ambition to tell that story, the story that it should be, was not going to be quite as intricate and layered and nuanced as A Gentleman in Moscow or Lincoln Highway or even Rules of Civility. I knew that. I knew it was going to be, you know, a little faster moving and a little more interested in a little bit more impressionistic. We meet these people. We meet Prentice. We meet, you know, Litsky, the photographer. We meet, you know, Wendell, the weasel. You know, and you're going to kind of see them in this as sort of, so in essence, criminal events unfold and at a rapid pace are resolved. And so all that made me feel like I didn't want to take that and say, well, let's add 200 pages of other stuff, you know, which felt like it would be, would maybe push it towards the complexity of a novel that I aim for, but on the other hand, would kind of undo a lot of what was there and the elegance of what's there and the sort of the freshness of what's there. So I ended up, you know, saying, you know what? It's going to be 200 pages. It's going to go through to its end.
Which, by the way, is a full novel length anyway. I don't even know why I'm calling it a novella.
No, you're right. I call it that. I mean, because you're right. My books tend to be 400, 500 pages, you know, so my novels are, you know, something like that. So it is shorter for me, you know.
But here's what's interesting then. In the shorter fictions, again, I read those first and then I read the larger ones. But now looking back, did you feel constrained by the short story format? Like maybe you wouldn't be able to get as much characterization out of some of these characters, or were you, you know, I don't know what you wrote first, honestly, the short stories or
Those short stories were all written in the last 10 years. Mm-hmm. And, but I've been writing short stories, as I say, for, you know, 40 years or whatever, and a little bit more than that. And I think you get a sense of this in reading. First of all, my short stories are a little longer than the average published short stories. Because the shorter length that you would find in the New Yorker or Paris Review or whatever is not long enough for me to do what I like to do. And so they might run along a little bit longer. But I think what they represent for the reader, or if someone's a fan of my work, you'll enjoy them even if you don't know my work. But if you're a fan of my work, what they do is they provide you a glimpse of, in essence, how I start things, right? Which is that, because the nature of the short story is it is a glimpse. You know, it might have a small narrative, but compared to a novel, but it's a glimpse of something, a glimpse of a person, a glimpse of a series of events, rather than this full drawn out picture. But that's a perfect place for me to experiment with some of these things we've talked about. What's the setting? What's the tone? What's the tone of voice? What's the psychology of the narrator? What's the perspective in this story? And how do we bring to life the people that the narrator bumps into? And how do we do it with efficiency and economy? And so the short story is a great place to experiment with those things. And so, you know, those 6 stories that are set in New York, they have the tone is shifting. The narrator, this type of narrator is shifting. It starts with omniscient, you know, and then it's kind of a series of stories where someone's observing somebody else. And then finally it's a story about something that's happening to the narrator. And so you have to make your choices about, I have an idea for a story. What is the best perspective from which to tell it? You know, which is in other words, am I in it? Am I watching it? Do I know everything about it? And what's the tone? which is different, right? The perspective or point of view is kind of how I'm situated to the events. What do I know about them? It's how close do I am to them. Whereas the tone might be, am I a sarcastic person or omniscient narrator with sarcasm? Am I a generous one? Am I an impatient narrator? Am I whatever? Because am I someone who, narrator who never finishes what he's trying to say? Those are choices that you're making in advance, and you're trying to feel out, I know what the story's about, I'm beginning to understand the characters and the events, but now the big question is, how am I going to tell this? From what angle? With what tone? And you start to experiment with different things, and you may rewrite the first couple of pages a number of times until you can kind of hear that voice. So as I say, these stories really provide, I think, the reader a sort of a window on the bigger process that's at play in the novel. And I'll say one other thing about it. I've been thinking a lot about this. I didn't used to think about it, but I've been thinking about it since I finished it. Is if you think about the novel as an art form, for the reader or for the writer, orientation is a very big component of it. So that when you take any novel you love, and go back and read the first 10 pages, and I guarantee you there's enormous amounts of information in those 10 pages that you may not even be conscious of, but that tell you, the where of it. Okay, so this is, Michigan in the 50s or whatever it is, okay, it's Paris in the 20s. It tells you some of the main characters. It gives you a glimpse of their backgrounds, of their personalities. It might give you a sense of the stakes that are about to follow. Dad is sick, or whatever the thing is. Or they're on their way to the funeral, I don't know. But the point being that there's a lot of that is going on very early in a novel, and that's basically about orientation. It's so that the reader who's about to go into this extended journey knows where they're starting, right? And so, because if you go into it, if a reader goes into a book where it seems uncertain of where it is or who they are or where we're going, you'll only go on for so long before that becomes frustrating, right? And so you want to lay some of that down so the reader feels confident that they know where they are, and then they can start to see how things unfold. And the way that novels build meaning is very much in a relationship to setting the reader comfortable in a situation and then shifting and providing more insight and deeper knowledge. And, but again, orientation is necessary to experience that unfolding that becomes the accumulation of meaning for the reader when taking in a novel, the emotional outcome, let's say, or whatever it is. Well, short stories, it's not that, right? You do not have the time to provide that orientation or to do this, to stretch out the culmination of events or the shifting emotions or the shifting whatever. It has to all come very fast. And so what happens as a result, I think, is that short story is very much one of the pleasures of the short story is that it's very much more, it's the opposite of orientation. It's about surprise. It's not about sort of having groundwork laid for me so I know where I am and now I can go on the journey. It's like, oh my God, wait, where are we? Wait, what did he say? Who is that? Who just said that? Where are they going? It starts kind of in the middle of things in a very strong way, and you have to kind of catch up. And then you're only going to get the glimpse, right? You're not going to see it all unfold. You're going to see everything, in this half an hour of this person's life or in this 3-day period. And you're going to try to have to kind of get a feel for where is this all headed in the long run, where I only have this little bit of information at my fingertips to gain a sense of that insight. And so, but I think that's, it's a different type of reading experience, but it's one that I think can be very enjoyable.
Yeah, and it's interesting seeing how you describe your process with the novels and then seeing how you do it in the short stories. It's almost like you have to pick and choose in the short stories. Okay, am I going to go deep into the ideas? Am I going to go deep into the character? Like, you're not given the full rainbow, so you're kind of trying to pick what colors you're going to use for each story. Whereas Gentleman in Moscow, I take that as the classic example. You've got this full Russian novel here from beginning to end. And yes, let's say the way it, like with a short story, the way it ends might be a surprise, but the surprise doesn't have to be as sharp. It doesn't have to be as harsh. Like a short story is gonna most likely end in a harsh way because it's like a magic trick. Like you built up the short story and then you the rabbit's no longer in the hat. Where is it? And you don't know. The short story's over. And,
Yeah, right.
Like, like I'm thinking, I mean, by the way, I never would bookmark fiction. I have your bookmarks all over your novels and short stories. But like, I love the Ballad of Timothy Touche or Touche. Touch it. Yeah. For one thing, I like how you are confronting issues in your own life in this short story. So like, for instance, we talked at the very beginning how, you came from a let's say upper middle class to upper class family. You went to the great schools. You spent 20 years working in the finance business, and you see this character, Timothy, who wants to be a novelist from a very early age. He's asking himself, oh, he wishes his parents were alcoholics or got divorced at least, or something, so he could have something to write about. Instead, everything's kind of gone well for him. But then this is the only time I've seen you refer to yourself. You say, you take about 300 or 400 words here to say, perhaps this assessment is too cynical. In all likelihood, it is influenced by the author's own experiences with compromise and his unself-conscious desire to make his choices seem inevitable, and so on. You really go into yourself a little bit for a few paragraphs, which you can argue for the sake of this story wasn't necessary, but you decided to include it anyway. Like you say, short stories about being a little bit more, I don't know how to say the word, so I'll say a different word, a little more minimal. So it could fit in the pages of a journal or whatever. But you allowed yourself to spend some words here on your own, kind of dealing with this issue of not having, maybe the conflicting background.
Yeah, and I because I find that fun. I mean, of course, in technical terms, it's whatever, it's the fourth wall kind of thing, right? Where suddenly, as a writer, you're addressing the audience as, I'm the guy writing this, by the way, and I believed him when he said it too, whatever the version is. And I've always enjoyed that when I encounter it in drama, and or we see it in in television or what have you. But that disorienting shift when we think we know the rules of the story. We're going to hear from the narrator, and this is going to happen, and then suddenly the narrator's like, no, I want to talk about myself for a second, And I think it adds a little sort of strange energy to it. Now, my English editor, my primary editor is, of course, in America, where I'm primarily published. But my English editor may weigh in and say, about the manuscript, and she wanted to remove that. And I was like, what? Remove it? Are you kidding? That's my favorite part.
The only reason I could see why she wanted to remove it is because I wondered out loud. I had to take a step back and ask, was this good or bad?
Yeah,
not in a critical way, but because you have to ask, like with a short story, it needs to have, like if I'm editing it, I'm thinking of what to cut. And this clearly was extra, so I have to, if I were your editor, I would have to give you permission to have extra in it. And
that's right.
But okay, I didn't really decide if this is your choice, but I thought it was a good thing because finally I get to see as the reader, and you've written a lot of words, this is an issue you're dealing with, the issue that Timothy's doing, and the issue that all writers deal with is, am I interesting enough? Look, Jack Kerouac probably didn't think he was interesting enough, so he had to hitchhike across the country and pick up someone who was interesting enough, Dean Moriarty,
Exactly.
Every writer you could see deals with this issue.
Yeah.
Marcel Proust had to pretend to be in high society to get stories. Truman Capote had to interview murderers to get stories. Like writers go through this. So this was seeing your glimpse into that.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's right.
And then of course, there was something else in here which is more subtly about you and about the process of writing, which is, okay, he's, how do I do this without, so he writes signatures of famous authors. Let's put it at that. And we don't know whether they're good or bad. We're kind of taking the word for it from one character. And then there's another character who has a different, maybe more impressive take on whether they're good or bad. And it's interesting to see these perspectives on not Timothy's ability as a writer, but literally Timothy's ability to mimic a writer's signature, which is perhaps metaphor for writing. And
Yeah.
I thought that was a very interesting way to do that metaphor.
Yeah, thank you.
And did I won't. I think with short stories you got to be much more careful than novels about giving
It's
stuff
true.
away.
It's
But
true.
I enjoyed all of them, like the I Will Survive, the Bootlegger, and I could see these are a little bit more you. Particularly, they're in New York. They're around
Yeah.
now. They're happening, and it's fascinating. You know, by the way, I read the stories before I read Eve in Hollywood. I wasn't quite sure if am I in for the 200 page? I'm just reading short stories here. Now I'm going to read a 200 page, quote unquote novella. But I did, and that led me to your other books, and it was so pleasurable. So for everybody listening, Table for Two is a must read. Of course, the other books are as well. How'd you feel about? I saw the trailer just a few minutes ago about A Gentleman in Moscow. How do you feel about their translation into TV?
I think they did a terrific job, and they're in many ways you write a Gentleman in Moscow is in a way like no longer mine. It's now in the possession of readers, and one of the great things about the series Gentleman in Moscow is that the writer, the director, the head of costume, the head of set design, Ewan McGregor, the star, Mary Elizabeth Winstead, who's the lead actress, and Ewan's wife. They were all very conscious of the fact that the expectations they had to meet were the readers, not mine, not Paramount's. But the question was, and they read the book very carefully, multiple times, and carved it up and marked it up themselves from each angle of their craft. What does the hotel look like? What are what are people wearing? What are the thematics that we're trying to express? And they really did a beautiful job. So it is, it's really an incredible visual experience to see it realized by them. And Ewan is amazing, and the series, Ewan's because he's the Count, is in almost every scene. It's an 8-hour series, and he's in almost every scene. He ages 30 years. He goes through a wider range of emotions and experiences, and he is unbelievable. It's terrific. And but I'll tell you, sort of a funny thing about it, to give you a flavor for like how much he thinks about it. We spent, he reached out before they were going into production and said, could you have an hour or two to do a Zoom with me? Because I want to know everything about the Count and the hotel and the story that is not in the book. I've read the book, multiple times. I want to know what's not there that could help me. And so, in the course of this, Zoom, we talked about different aspects and he asked questions, and I offered up different things that are not in the book that I thought would be of interest to him. And eventually we got to, he said, how does it begin? And he sort of like you were asking earlier. And so I walked him through kind of the process of inventing the character and where I started and the sort of the iterative cycle of getting a richer and richer sense. And then I talked about the few sentences at the beginning of, the book where I really sort of knew the Count more sharply. Well, last week was the premiere in New York City. And so after the premiere, he and I were talking in the at the after party, and he came up and he said, "Hey, we were talking about one of the opening scenes, or one of the scenes in the first hour." And as he says, "Hey, did you notice? You notice that when Halecki calls me to his office, did you notice?" And I'm like, "No, Ewan, notice what?" And he goes, "I took the stairs 2 steps at a time, as had been my habit since the academy." So he had logged this from our conversation, which was 2 years before. And much as I, used it a way as an orientation for myself in inventing the narrative, when I had told him that story, he was like, "Yep, I get it." And he used it. And he then said, he said, it took me a while. I had to train myself to take the steps 2 at a time. And he said, but he says, you'll notice that later in the series, when I age, I start taking them 1 step at a time. When I've lost that thing.
And the book says, I think it was 1946.
Yeah.
1946. It says he starts taking them 1 step at a time, and that's your way of saying he views himself as older, which I thought it was much better than him just thinking to himself, "Oh, I'm older now."
Yeah. So you can see, it's not like just a payday for you and or whatever. It is he has internalized as best he can both the experience of the count, the personality count, and the language of the book as a way of trying to, through acting, realize the character.
It's interesting because A Gentleman in Moscow, one of the attractive things about it is it's a weirdly aspirational kind of book in that all people have this feeling that they would like to be, I don't want to say aristocratic in a boring way, but people want to move up in wealth and class and be able to enjoy fine things in life. So it's aspirational in the sense that here's somebody who, regardless of how you strip him of title and home and whatever, he has this quality to him, this personality to him, but also this idea of living in a hotel is very aspirational. I'll tell you, when I first moved to New York City as an adult, after a year or so, and I finally was making a little bit better living, I moved into the Chelsea Hotel and stayed there for many years.
Sure.
Yeah, so I lived in a hotel for a long time, and I kind of know that feeling of knowing the people who work in the restaurant for years, knowing the people who work behind, the bellhop and so on, knowing all the bellhops and knowing the maids and knowing, all the people. About half the people lived at that time in the 90s, about half the people lived in the Chelsea Hotel and half the people were vacationing they were staying as hotel guests. And so there's a weird dynamic when that happens of shifting characters and stories. And so I got that feeling when I was reading through this, that it felt like that feeling that I once felt. So, which for me is an aspirational kind of feeling, because I always loved the idea of living in a hotel.
No, I'm jealous of your experience. I would have loved to have lived in the Hotel Chelsea for a while.
It was fascinating. Particularly, you're like just a few years older than me, so it was a very good time in the 90s to live there.
No, I remember it. I remember it.
And I've one smaller question that's kind of a final question, but there's a lot of patience in your books, and obviously, as you described, the way you write it, I mean, some novelists write a book a year. Like a lot of thriller writers write a book a year, it's not a criticism. Their books are great. It's no criticism. Your process is a little different. You said you take like 2, 3, 4 years maybe to set the characters and then to start figuring out the plots and what's happening. And then you sit down and it takes you a year and a half to write the book. So there's a lot of patience. And the books themselves, like, again, A Gentleman in Moscow, it takes place over a period of many decades. And so there's a certain patience with the reader kind of dives into this world knowing he's going to be in there for many decades. And this is an odd question, but before you were writing these novels, you worked for financial asset management firm. And I took the liberty of looking at the portfolio of that firm in the 13F filings. Your stocks, I'm not yours, okay, and you're not involved with the company anymore, and I don't know, you haven't been for 10 years, but the portfolio picks are very patient. I mean, instead of being in the hottest new AI company, your biggest, the big, and again, it's not yours, the firm exists without you, it's grown, but it's a construction company, it's the largest pick in the portfolio. Like, it's really like, there's a patience to that portfolio. It's not the average portfolio. And is this like a reflection of your personality a little bit, the patience throughout all of these activities?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, in the investment arena, we were very interested in essence, we had a research-driven process and value bias. We focused on higher quality businesses. But if you summed it up, we were interested in arbitraging the short-term fluctuation in perception against the long-term excellence of a company. So, the stocks in a company can go up and down for all kinds of reasons, and they're not always necessarily even related to they're certainly not related to the long-term prospects of the company. They may not even be related to the short-term prospects of the company. They may be related to a shift in attitude or a change in the economy and all these kinds of things. So that's the beauty of the stock market, is that it's constantly changing in the short term, the valuation of a business, which over the long term shouldn't vary that much, from where it's headed, if it's a business that you can understand into the future. So that, that's patience is rewarded if you have the discipline to choose selectively, and in the investment business, and that's the way that we approached the art. In my writing, I never really thought about it as sort of the Canadian, but you're right. I mean, I think that I don't think I learned this from the investment business into my writing, but it is the nature of writing. If you think about it in your life, like if you have children, dealing with your siblings, dealing with financial decisions in your life, whatever else. If you pushed aside everything and you gave yourself like lots of time to how you're going to raise your kids, or how you're going to respond to your mother, or how you're going to deal with the situation that surfaced with your sibling, or whatever the issues are, you would take that time and sort of think it all out, and to prepare, and to be judicious, and to find the right attitude, and say the right things, and you'd be a perfect person. But life's not like that, right? It happens at a pace where your best instincts and your best intentions are often overwhelmed by the sudden surge of the emotion, or the mishearing, or the whatever, the battle of the conversation, or all these things that lead you, or you're exhausted, or you're exasperated, or whatever the difference. So, writing is a world in which it's all slowed down, right? There's no, in the way that I approach it, right? I don't have to publish a book every year, so I don't have that. I can spend 4 years, I can spend 5 years. I have nobody who's asking me what's happening in it. Nobody knows what's happening in it. It's all to me. I don't share it with anybody. And what that allows, I have to have a certain amount of patience and endurance, because I'm going to spend 4 years writing it. No one's going to see it, and I'm not going to know what they think about it. And I don't know if it's going to be successful, but that's fine. What I gain is that I can get myself down to, in a way, I could be my best self, as a human being, which is that as I'm listening to the characters, as I'm drafting the character, presenting the characters, as I'm creating this world, I don't have to fall on any sense of urgency or impatience or frustration or whatever. I can build it all on, the pursuit of understanding reality and human nature in its finest form, and then to try to relay it in a fashion which is at its finest level. And so yes, the freedom of time in the writing process allows me to, I think, to achieve a better outcome than I could.
There's the freedom of time. I'm just curious though, if the psychology of it, like many people don't want the patience because they want the book to get out so they could know if people are going to like it.
You're right. And you have to, I don't tell people what my books are about, because they give you a dopamine it's counterproductive. Like if I have a great idea for a novel and I'm working on it, and I went out to dinner and I said, oh yeah, this is what I'm working on, and I rattle off the story, and they're like, oh, that's great, dopamine surge, and I'm like, yeah, there we go, I made somebody happy with that. Well, you do that 50 times and you're like, I'm not interested in the story anymore. So you have to kind of reverse it, and you have to say, okay, I'm going to get a big dopamine hit when this lands, and I am going to preserve a sense of internal urgency by deferring the smallest window of pleasure from this task until the last minute, and you just keep the discipline of deferring the potential for pleasure of eventually someone reading the story until I'm absolutely done. And that's that looking forward to that moment helps me in a way survive the 4 years in silence.
Well, thank you for being patient with all my questions. I really appreciate it. I mean, it's a pleasure to talk to an author like you and indulge myself in learning the process. Plus, I just absolutely love the books. I did not expect to. I really love minimalist writers. I mean, I hate categorizing writers at all. You could be minimalist, you could be maximalist. It doesn't matter. But I really tend towards like, let's say, I don't know if you follow like a Dennis Johnson type of short story writer, or I can name a dozen others, but I absolutely loved every word in your novels. I've read them out loud to my wife. She really appreciated the scene when he first meets, his lady friend and the dogs.
Yeah.
Like,
Yes,
because she thinks that's how parents mess up with kids, is not training their dogs like that. Like, so she's like, really, she said, tell him when you talk to him, I said that about that scene. So I'm telling you.
Okay, I will. Thank you. James, it's been a pleasure. It was really, I appreciate all the thoroughness with which you read my work. I appreciate what you've had to say about it. I appreciate the nuances of your questions.
Yeah, thank you. And good luck with both the release of Table for Two. Good luck with the launch of the show. And please, when your next book comes out, come on the podcast again. I'd love to chat.
Thanks. It'd be my pleasure.